In the winter of 547 BC, the Persian king Cyrus II debates his next move. At Tyria in ancient Anatolia, he had fought the powerful Lydian army to a draw. Croesus, king of Lydia, has begun to withdraw to his capital, so sure of victory come the spring that he disbands his mercenary forces as he does so. Meanwhile, Cyrus cautiously tails him. Cyrus knows that Croesus has depleted his numbers, but he also knows he is not facing some petty king of a backward land. Croesus is arguably the wealthiest king of the known world. He has many potent allies that he has summoned to his aid. Come spring, it is likely that Cyrus will face overwhelming numbers. His officers advise a withdrawal back to the Persian interior, but Cyrus gambles on a winter push. He aims to risk it all in a single decisive strike at the very heart of his enemy's kingdom. Croesus rises to the challenge and deploys his men close to Sardis. For Cyrus, this battle will either mark the end of his meteoric rise or cement his name in the long history of great men and empires. Studying the great campaigns of history, we often see men who carried the immense pressure of their empires entirely on their own shoulders. But in our modern lives, we shouldn't have to carry our burdens in silence. Many men silently carry stress, pressure, and personal struggles every day. No one has to go through it alone. With today's sponsor, BetterHelp, there's someone always with you, someone trained to listen. Therapy is a great way to learn how to carry that pressure differently, helping you realize you don't have to handle everything alone. BetterHelp makes therapy accessible wherever you are, whether online or through the app. Their quiz assesses your needs and quickly matches you with a credentialed therapist online. You can communicate however you feel comfortable, phone, video, or text, and easily switch therapists to find the right fit. In fact, 82% of clients recommend their therapist. Over 6 million people worldwide to date have gotten help through BetterHelp, earning a 4.8 out of 5 rating on the App Store. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/HistoryMarche to get 10% off your first month of therapy. BetterHelp is here with you. In 559 BC, the Near East was dominated by the neighboring powers of the Medes and Babylonians. Both had allied to destroy the former Assyrian Empire in 612 and had coexisted in the region for the following decades. The Mede king Astyages could certainly expect to maintain this status quo. The man who would upset this balance of power had his family origins in the 7th century. A young dynasty founded by Achaemenes ruled Persis, a subject kingdom of the Medes. By the birth of Cyrus, Cambyses I ruled as the king of Anshan. The old legend has it that Cambyses' son Cyrus was born out of fear. Astyages, afraid of a dream in which his daughter passed so much water that it covered all of Asia, married her to this quiet, dependable king. Furthermore, interpreting this and a subsequent dream as a threat to his power, he ordered the baby sired through the union to be put to death. Fortunately for the infant Cyrus, the man tasked with the deed could not follow through, and Cyrus was ultimately raised for a time by a shepherd. The man who had initially spared the prince, Harpagus, would pay a heavy price for his insubordination, with his monarch serving him his own decapitated son at a banquet. By doing so, Astyages had created a powerful enemy. Harpagus patiently awaited Cyrus's coming of age and then revealed his heritage, urging the young prince to rise up against his murderous grandfather. In 559, Cyrus finally assumed the kingship of Anshan. Initially, Astyages held little regard for this petty subject within his vast domain. However, when Cyrus refused to acknowledge his vassalage, the Mede king moved to finally rid himself of this upstart prince. To this end, he made the huge blunder of sending an army under Harpagus to confront Cyrus. Having been the man to urge rebellion in the first place, Harpagus quickly defected. Herodotus describes the battle mostly being fought by a portion of the army, not party to Harpagus's plan. He took a portion of the men with him, while the greater part, lacking discipline, simply fled the field. The second battle that Herodotus cites did not go any better for the Medes. Astyages is said to have mustered a second force made up of weaker troops, mostly youths and old men. These too were defeated, with Astyages himself being captured. The Babylon Chronicle states that the Median king was handed over, probably to the delight of Harpagus, as detailed in Herodotus. What we do know for certain is that Ecbatana fell soon after. One man who did not greet the fall of Astyages well was the king of Lydia, Croesus. Croesus was the fifth in a line of Myrmidai monarchs, beginning with Gyges. In the previous century, Gyges had overthrown the previous dynasty. Herodotus wrote that he was forced into the coup when the king Candales forced him to watch his queen undress, a grave violation. Having glimpsed Gyges at the door, the queen later gave Gyges the choice of execution or regicide. Gyges chose the latter and married the queen. Fanciful tales aside, what we do know is that Croesus's line had seized power through force, and that by the reign of Croesus's father, Alyattes, Lydia's expanding borders had brought about conflict with the Median kingdom to the east. The excuse was the Lydians' harboring of some Scythian refugees, and the war would rage on for around 5 years. In one of those rarer instances where we know the exact date of a battle in these earlier times, on the 28th of May 585 BC, a solar eclipse interrupted a battle between these powers. Taken as an ill omen by both sides, they came to a peace brokered by Cilicia and Babylon. The border was fixed at the Halys River, while the son of Cyaxares, the ill-starred Astyages, was married to Arienus, daughter of Alyattes and sister to Croesus. This peace would last more than 3 decades, but was effectively shattered by the actions of Cyrus in overthrowing the new Lydian monarch's brother-in-law. While not as spectacular a rise as Cyrus and the Persians, Croesus was no military sluggard. He was briefly opposed by a faction supporting Pantaleon, his half-brother, but he had been chosen to succeed by Alyattes. We know that his reign likely began with a court purge, with at least one supporter of Pantaleon put to death. Croesus succeeded Alyattes around 560, and immediately attacked the city of Ephesus. Ephesus had provoked his wrath following the tyrant Pindar's refusal to acknowledge his authority. Another hypothesis is that Pindar's family were connected to Pantaleon through his mother, and that Ephesus was therefore being punished for supporting the losing side in the succession struggle. Whatever the exact cause of hostilities, the Ephesians were either besieged, as detailed by Herodotus, or compelled to submit by Croesus. The story of Pindar suggesting the city folk link their walls to the temple of Artemis may have been myth, though Croesus's connection to the wonder is not. Croesus did extend his rule through various campaigns against the remaining mainland Ionian Greek settlements. Following this, it seems he fully intended to take to the sea and subjugate the islands of the region too. He began preparing to construct a fleet, but then thought better of it when an advisor used a false story of the islanders coming with 10,000 horses. At this, Croesus was pleased, but it was pointed out that the islanders would be equally joyous to catch the Lydians at sea, outside of their area of competence. He called off the construction of the fleet and allied with the remaining Ionian Greeks. After this, Croesus had effectively subdued all the peoples west of the Halys, apart from the Lycians and Cilicians. The Lycians were a tough mountain-dwelling folk who often fought ferociously and to the death. The Cilicians occupied the area that controlled the Cilician Gates and were protected by the Taurus Mountains. They were a useful buffer state between the major powers, as previously seen with their help brokering a peace between Lydia and the Medes. The Lydian monarch was now the master of Western Anatolia. He was arguably the richest king in the known world, and could be secure in the good relations he had with his neighbours, including, until relatively recently, the Medes. So, when the famous Athenian lawgiver Solon allegedly visited him, he was shocked at his indifferent attitude to his wealth. Solon is supposed to have said that no man should be called happy until he is dead, as life is uncertain and fate could still intervene. Whether or not the visit really took place, the story is a good moral tale about the complacency of the king, a trait that would soon come to play a decisive part in his own story. While similarly dubious, like the Solon encounter, Croesus lost his son Attis in a hunting accident around 552, after having had a prophetic dream that Attis would be killed by a spear point. The loss of his son would have been a great blow to the king. Just 2 years later, Astyages would be overthrown. Following the rise of this Persian upstart, Croesus resolved to strike while he still could. In truth, he likely simply wanted an excuse to expand his own domains eastwards, and so began preparations for war. Firstly, however, he needed divine approval. He sent representatives to the oracle at Delphi, and the answer he received was exactly what he had hoped. If Croesus marched against the Persians, then he shall destroy a great empire. He was furthermore advised to seek alliance with the greatest of the Greeks, and so he eagerly set about determining this. This, unsurprisingly, were the Spartans, fresh from their war with the Tegeans, and now the leading power of the Peloponnese. Croesus sent gifts, and a friendship was formed to add to the Lydian monarch's network of alliances, which included the Babylonians and Egypt. The formidable coalition looked set to overwhelm the young Persian Empire. In 547, all was set, and Croesus marched towards Persian Cappadocia. Before setting off, though, he received some pessimistic advice from one Sardanus in his entourage. The men he would fight were tough and dwelt in a rugged and unforgiving land. What exactly would be achieved if he was victorious? More pointedly, what would be lost? His own rich lands west, if he were overcome? Yet, unlike the advice concerning his planned invasion of the islands, the Lydian king was unmoved. Reaching the Halys, 2 accounts of the crossing are passed down to us. One has the Lydians merely crossing the available bridges, but according to the other, these bridges were not yet built. At a loss as to how to cross, it was then that Thales of Miletus suggested parting the river to make 2 fordable branches. Thales is famous as a philosopher, but he was also a mathematician and engineer. He had apparently predicted the eclipse that had halted the fighting at the Battle of the Eclipse, and had even measured the height of the pyramids. Having taken Thales' advice, the Lydian army dug the channel, and with this accomplished, the army proceeded towards the city of Tyria. Cyrus was not there to meet them, so the Lydians ravaged the region, took the city itself, and enslaved its people. He also captured the towns in the vicinity. Cyrus, informed of the Lydian preparations by deserters and spies, had already responded by mustering his own army and was moving west via the town of Arbela. Meanwhile, the Persian monarch had already sent heralds ahead to the Ionian Greeks, urging them to rise up against Croesus. Despite their earlier treatment, they did not oblige. The 2 armies clashed at Tyria. Herodotus relates that the fighting was hard and that both armies sustained losses, but could not break the other. Nightfall ended the day's struggle, but the next day Cyrus seemed unwilling to commit to a second day of battle. Croesus, for his part, was unhappy with his army and also did not force another day's fighting. He had fewer numbers and decided to withdraw for the winter and supplement his strength by calling on his powerful allies in the Babylonians, Egyptians, and Spartans. It was a good plan, and by all conventions of the time, this should have paused hostilities. Cyrus, however, was no ordinary commander. Well aware of Lydia's allies, he rejected the advice to similarly withdraw and then moved towards Sardis. Croesus, sure his enemy would not brave a winter assault, had even disbanded the mercenaries of his army and at Sardis set about summoning his allies for the next campaigning season. Cyrus's speed was so great that the Lydian king barely had time to respond. Though somewhat incredible, given it was Lydian territory, Cyrus was supposedly even the first to announce his presence to the Lydian king. The decisive clash would center on the plain of Thymbra, outside of Sardis itself. Croesus, once surprised of the worrying approach of Cyrus, sent frantic orders for his own men to reassemble, with riders likely crisscrossing the land to nearby cities and settlements. He armed as many men as could be found in Sardis itself, and then began to deploy on the plain. While the exact location is not known, we know it must have been close to Sardis given subsequent events. Tributaries of the Hermus River flowed through the area. It is likely the fighting took place a little away from Sardis itself, rather than directly outside of its gates. Having deployed, it was Cyrus that had the problem. While Croesus's army had been hastily assembled, he still held the great advantage of his elite cavalry. Placing these on the wings with a large body of infantry in the center, Cyrus would likely have expected Croesus to attempt to flank and overwhelm his army. The shock of a cavalry charge cannot be understated. In this case, with such large bodies of horse, the ground would shake to herald the imminent clash of beast, muscle, and iron. All the receiving infantry could do was mass a few ranks deep. They would root their spears in place, which would take out the foremost cavalrymen and their horses. However, the sheer force of the charge would likely break the lines. To mitigate this, Herodotus writes that Harpagus thought to use an unlikely weapon. The Persians had learned that the camels used as beasts of burden for his baggage terrified the horses of the Lydian cavalry. Whether it was simply the novelty of the animals alone, or truly their stench and misshapen appearance, Cyrus was likely not bothered and took the advice of his lieutenant. Cyrus had his men mount these beasts with spears and moved them forward of his infantry. Meanwhile, his own cavalry and chariots were positioned a little back from the main body and would not receive the charge. Unaware of these moves, Croesus ordered his unstoppable cavalry to charge and do their bloody work. While generally unreliable, as Xenophon's account of the battle is part of a more idealized work on how a leader should behave rather than a dedicated historical account, the Persian formation, described as a square, or perhaps refused wings to receive the Lydians as they charged, does make sense as the Persians advanced. The Lydian cavalry had not even contacted Cyrus's lines when the camels, brought forward as a screen, indeed panicked and sowed chaos in the Lydian ranks. Some horses simply stopped in their tracks. Others veered away on a new course or threw their riders. Whether through aversion to the stink or sight of these creatures, the Lydian assault lost all of its momentum. In addition, it's probable the fighting men on these camels took full advantage at this point, striking at nearby riders from camelback, further adding to the chaos. The rear ranks of the Persian lines could also have peppered the rear ranks of the halting cavalry, though poor visibility and the risk of friendly fire mean this remains speculative. Meanwhile, Cyrus made sure to keep up the pressure on the main body of the Lydian infantry, using the arrows and stones of his archers and slingers. Persian infantry would have been armed with bows, as well as melee weapons, and this steady barrage, as well as the evident failure of their cavalry to smash the Persian lines, must have rattled the rear ranks. To their credit, this nasty surprise was not the end for the Lydians. In a show of discipline and courage, many dismounted and reformed, charging the camels and Persian infantry on foot. Cyrus likely sent his own cavalry to harass and pursue the fleeing Lydians, whilst also readying their own charge to counter the Lydians. On more equal a footing and perhaps suffering their own storm of terror via the Persian bowmen, the remaining Lydians fought well, exacting their own blood price. However, with the likely addition of part of the Persian cavalry charging into them too, it was not to be for Croesus's elite on the wings. They fragmented and fled, some from the field and into Sardis itself, many back into the Lydian main body, who now stood alone to receive the Persian onslaught. Cyrus ordered his forces to fully focus on the main body, though he would have done so steadily, fully leveraging his own advantage of the Persian and Median bow to wreak more havoc on the Lydian lines. The Lydians would have responded in kind, but given the Persian advantage of morale and momentum, gaps must have formed in the Lydian main body. Once sufficiently softened up, the Persian infantry would have closed in for melee. Perhaps many Lydians had already fled back to Sardis, which was so close and so tempting. With their flanks exposed, elements of the Persian cavalry would have sniped at and charged from all directions, completing the disaster. While exact details are vague in Herodotus, a possible collapse scenario could have come with the flight of Croesus himself, or perhaps simply when the situation was perceived as untenable by enough men. If so, those less heavily engaged, often toward the rear, may have been the first to peel away, maybe following their fleeing monarch into nearby Sardis. What we do know is, both Croesus and enough of his army made it back to the capital to force Cyrus to invest the city. Reaching Sardis, Cyrus's joy at the Lydian collapse may have been offset somewhat by the next serious challenge ahead. He had surrounded Croesus, but this was the Lydian capital. The walls were large and thick. One side of the city was enclosed by walls built into rocky heights, which were considered extremely difficult to assail. The city was also stocked with food, provisions, as well as gold, silver, and treasures. Though the Lydian army had collapsed, many had re-entered, and they were more than enough to man the defenses. Clearly, starving out the Lydians was not a realistic option. Croesus had already sent word to his allies, and could expect relief, even if it took months. Despite the difficulties then, Cyrus needed to take Sardis by storm. After 14 days, he therefore sent word that he would reward the man who first scaled the walls. He sent horsemen about the walls to scout the various points, and following this, the army attacked. Though lacking details, the fighting must have been fierce. Scaling ladders and attacking the weak points, the Lydians more than held their own. Perhaps with his remaining men successfully repulsing Cyrus's army, Croesus could still be confident of ultimate success. Sparta would send ships and troops, and his other allies would eventually come, if only the Lydians remained steadfast behind their mighty walls. With this effort in vain, Cyrus called off the attack. However, once the last of his men had pulled back to the camp, a warrior named Hieroides decided to scout a difficult approach, that of an unassailable direction into the city. It was unguarded as it was assumed impregnable. Yet the sharp-eyed Hieroides spied a Lydian soldier climb down part of the cliff to retrieve his fallen helmet, and surmised that if he could come down, then Hieronymus and many like him could go up. Exploiting this, the Persians scaled up the route, taking the city garrison off guard, and began to overrun the defences and the city. A decent course of events is that the infiltrators fought their way to the gate and opened it for the rest of Cyrus's army, or that they held a section of the wall long enough to allow the Persians a foothold into the city, and then later on opened the gates. While Herodotus is short on details, he does mention the city going over to plunder. It's likely the defenders on the walls put up some limited resistance, as well as at the gates. A near-death experience suffered by Croesus himself indicates this. In better times, Croesus had tried everything to cure his mute second son. As with his preparations for the war, the king had similarly consulted the oracle at Delphi on this matter. However, he was warned in so many words to be careful what he wished for, as when he did finally hear the voice of his son, it would be on an evil day, and so it proved. Croesus, now caring little for life, did not move to defend himself when a Persian warrior moved to strike him down. It was at this instant that his son was said to have shouted, "Man, slay not Croesus." Whatever the truth of the story, it is clear Cyrus wanted his Lydian rival taken alive, and so it came to pass. Cyrus had harsh plans for the Lydian ruler, if Herodotus is to be believed on this point. Having created a pyre, he had Croesus and some other Lydians placed there, and at the absolute low point of his life, the Lydian monarch, recalling that other fanciful episode in his life, muttered the name of Solon. He had remembered the words that only the dead can be accounted happy, since life has not revealed all that it has in store. Cyrus, having asked who the man was that Croesus called upon, relented and tried to have the flames doused. Perhaps he feared a similar reversal of fortune for himself. Seeing this, Croesus called upon Apollo, and with every other effort failing a heavy rain, finally doused the flames, saving Croesus from a terrible fate. Croesus, suitably humbled, survived the war and became an advisor to Cyrus, though the independent kingdom of Lydia was no more. In the end, he had fulfilled the great prophecy that he would destroy a great empire if he crossed the Halys. He had simply never considered that it would be his kingdom brought low. With the fall of Sardis, the kingdom indeed folded too, and this shocked the known world. The Spartans, having promised to send ships and men to aid the Lydians, were astonished to learn that the city had fallen. The Babylonians to the south could also fear this decisive shift of the balance of power. Indeed, Cyrus agreed that his sights should be set on this other powerful rival. He moved back towards Ecbatana, installing Tabulus with a garrison. No sooner had he left, did the Lydians revolt. This was to be short-lived, however. Bactrides, who Cyrus had entrusted to gather tribute, did besiege the Persian governor in Sardis, but did not face Mazares. After a time of moving between refuges, Bactrides was ultimately handed over to the Persians. With Lydia thus subdued, Cyrus could fully turn his attention to the Babylonian threat and cement his legacy as a man truly deserving of the title, the Great. I appreciate you being here for the video. Please give that subscribe button a gentle medieval slap and tickle the like button to appease the almighty algorithm. It will help out the channel greatly. Cheers.